My father won a medal from the Queen because in 1953 he saw a bus had crashed over the cliffs, a school bus, and it fell into. I was born in Malta, as my father was, and it fell into the very cold at the time Mediterranean Sea, went quite a long way underwater, like maybe 20 meters or something. And the school children had all gotten out, but the bus driver was trapped in the bus. He'd been unconscious for 20 minutes. And my father jumped into the cold sea, went down, got him out, and he won a medal for it.
Super excited to have a chat today with Simon Borg Olivier, a name I've heard quite a bit, and it's really like sort of passed my awareness a bit over the years. And we do have a mutual friend in common, Simon, who's actually been a guest on this show before, and that's Professor Mark Cohen. And he speaks very, very highly of you. But one of the intentions about me setting up these conversations about breathing with people was really to start with keeping it local, you know, and I found this to be so fascinating that sometimes we search outside of ourselves, first of all, but also it can really make things more complicated than they are. And so when I started my breathing journey, I traveled around the world, right? And I was looking for teachers and I was looking for experts. And what's actually been so amazing in the last couple of years of, you know, we've kind of been forced to keep it local here in Australia in a sense, but there's been so many gifts in that. And I've actually found that there are so many of these, you know, experts, and I like to call them just breathing wizards, right? People that have been looking into the breath for a lifetime, potentially, or at least a lot longer than I have been. And often they are right around the corner. And so it's actually been really nice to have local people, Australian experts when it comes to all things breathing. And I particularly was hoping to speak to someone when it comes to yoga, someone that really understands, or at least has his own interpretation, which I think is really important, of the world of yoga and how we can perhaps tie that back to a conversation about breathwork in the modern world today. So thanks for joining us. And maybe to start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe just what you do today?
Well, today hasn't been that exciting because I had a very late night last night, so I only got up an hour ago to get my son to school. I'm a glorified Uber driver, free for my children, my teenage kids, you know, so I'm at that age in life where I've got 2 teenage kids. As a householder, that has affected my personal practice a little bit. When I was I didn't have kids till I was 44. So up until then, I could really devote 6 hours a day to practice often. And that was magical, you know, sometimes more, sometimes 8, 9 hours a day. Sometimes people think that's excessive. But when you compare it to, say, a serious person who's into physical health, such as, say, an Olympic athlete, then, you know, 6 to 8 hours a day is quite standard. And if you want to learn anything, if you want to become good at anything, you need 6 or 8 hours a day. So I used to relish those times in my life when I devote that much time. Now it's a little bit less. Now, if I can get a couple of hours, I feel I'm doing good.
This morning, maybe an interesting question for me to ask, because I always like to ask this question at some point during the interview, but it's nice to start there. So what does your personal practice look like? And when I say today, I might mean just like on a good day, right?
I have a very varied personal practice. It depends on where I am in time and space, and where I am also with what's going on in my life. So ideally, and this includes, say, for example, next week, I'm about to run a retreat. And in that retreat, I do for my group what I choose to do for myself. And that little routine is magical for me. What I begin with is a little bit of chanting, and it can be simple chanting, like the most simplest, maybe just a humming sound, which might migrate into an Om sound, or maybe I might do it with a Sanskrit chant, or sometimes I like just getting on my piano or getting on my guitar and just singing some of the songs that I've written, mostly in English, and just to get my voice happening. And with my voice, then of course comes the lungs and the chest and a bit of warmth. And this leaves me in a very good place then to do a static meditative practice. So I love a little static meditative practice in the morning. And that might be for, after I do maybe 45 minutes of chanting, I might do 45 minutes of seated practice. And then after that, I do a series of joint movements. And these joint movements I call joint synergy. I work with every main joint complex, but only the joint complexes, not individual joints, because individual joints are usually linear in their movements. You know, for example, the joints that move your elbow, for example, can bend and straighten. But the elbow can also turn in and turn out, pronate, supinate. So what I do is I do movements in joints which can be combined to make curved movements. So then the movement I'll do will be palm down, palm up, bend elbow, straighten elbow. And these more circular movements start to really move blood and at the same time create like this energetic exchange, perhaps related to some sort of piezoelectric effect in the cells, because the cells all have a crystalline structure. And when you put mechanical pressure on a crystalline structure, you generate. So these joint movements, then I make them start from my core. So I let them first connect with my core, which is, you know, the enteric nervous system right between the navel and the pubic bone. And then I actually start my core moving to make my joints move. And I do this with every joint. And then once I've practiced with every joint, then I do it with my spine. And then once I do it with my spine, I do the same process of working with breath control, where my breath control practice is I don't think so much about breathing in, breathing out. I think about expanding and contracting my core and my trunk and my entire body. And if my glottis or my nose is open and I expand my trunk, say by expanding the upper back outwards and the chest forward, or rounding the lower back out and the abdomen outwards, that expansion will usually cause a suction-like pressure, which will pull air into my nose. And then when I compress my body, air tends to go out. But of course, that look, which might be something like chest expand, contract, which is what you can see here, I can do whether I'm breathing or not.
Yes.
So I do it either with air coming in and out or without air coming in and out. And this starts to really massage and manipulate the internal organs. It builds up a lot of carbon dioxide if you do it without air, which can really then, so that becomes my breath practice. And then I finish my morning practice with a meditative practice, which includes joints moving from my core, my spine moving from my core, my entire trunk moving from the core, which affects the flow of air coming in and out of me. And sometimes just I do it, you know, holding my breath for periods of time. Sometimes I do the entire practice underwater. So I have a whole sequence that I do underwater. Less so right now because my pool is about 8 degrees or something. But when it's warmer, I'm very keen and I go in the water usually every day of the year if I can. And that's my morning practice. And it takes me about between 2 to 4 hours to work like that. And then my afternoon practice, I utilize the same sets of movements, which if someone were to look at those movements, someone might say, oh, it looks like Qigong, it looks like Tai Chi, it looks like internal martial arts when I do it quickly, or it looks just like dance. And I don't care what people think it looks like. It's just my movement as I've described it. But that's what it might look like on the outside. And then in the afternoon, I use that same system to move in a way that I end up in the more commonly seen yoga postures that many people see in the world of modern yoga today. And I find it's a very effective system then to very effectively come into postures which you can have a meditative place to be in. You can change the type of breath work that you do because your lungs have changed in their orientation, and your chest cavity is in a different place, your diaphragm's in a different place. So the breath control I do in different postures is quite profoundly different to what you might do in a simple seated or standing position. And then at the same time, you develop strength without the feeling of tension, flexibility without feeling like you're doing strong stretch, blood flow while the heart rate stays very, very low, and a sense of meditation without that thing that many people associate meditation with. Many people think meditation are sitting in an uncomfortable position in a boring way, but for me, I can meditate either stationary or in dynamic activity. Obviously, there's slight things that you can or can't do with either. But nowadays, especially since the world has, changed its ability to travel, the last 2 years, I spent a lot more on my desk, a lot more time at my desk. So I don't really get called as much to do a static meditative practice. I'd prefer to do a dynamic meditative practice. Or at least if I'm in a stationary posture, I'd rather it was a yoga posture, which might be upside down or right way up, or balancing on one arm or balancing on one leg. And I feel I get better benefits for this. So then my afternoon practice might be anything from, as little as 30 minutes to as much as 3 or 4 hours, like that. And then I might do something in the evening, which for me, by choice, will be something like going for a dance, which part of most of that's very gentle and introverted. But if I'm with friends, then there'll be at least 10% of the time where I just go completely banana, spin on my head, and have a great time, because it's about enjoying your life. That's my loose ideal practice. But on the days where we have to sit at our desk all day, it might mean that if I'm sitting for a prolonged period, I might just do some breath control at my desk. I might just hold my breath for a whole period where I'm doing things. I might go outside quickly, go onto my daughter's flying silk apparatus and hang upside down, do some simple chin-ups, some abdominal work, anything at all, because I feel that we need to, on a daily level, address our physical body, make sure it stays functioning. I'm not interested in really improving strength or flexibility. I'm 62, I don't think I'm going to be an Olympic athlete, and I don't really care to go back to learning one-handed handstands, or although I can if I want to. So my more important focus is, can I make sure that I can maintain the ability to walk, move, sit, stand, the activities of daily life, and that I'm pain-free? So at least part of my practice addresses the physical body. Then a lot of my practice addresses my physiology. So I want to make sure that my internal organs are functioning well, especially the immune system, which is, of course, very important in this day and age when everyone's complaining about anyone who sneezes or coughs. You don't want to get sick. And you want also your cells to be always in a place where they can regenerate and you feel calm and relaxed. And I want enhanced blood flow so you stay energized. And then I'll spend some time always addressing my mental state. And for the mental state, I try and find these meditative places where my mind is what I'll call engaged. And engaged to me means doing something where I feel connected with the activity in the present moment, and it's exciting enough to be interesting, but not so exciting it becomes stressful, and it's calming enough to be relaxing. And that little region that we live in, which lies between the borders of boredom and stress, which we call excited calmness, that's the freedom that we have in our life. And for some people, if they get a little bit excited, they get stressed, a little bit calm, they get bored. So the bigger you can make the distance between those two things, the more freedom you have in your life. Because I think the most important thing we have to establish is the ability to be free.
Right. And sitting here like listening, it's very interesting, and I love the practice. I'd love to give it a try myself one day too, which I'm sure will happen. But what I'm really feeling is a sense of freedom just coming off this screen. And freedom, of course, is a big personal choice, but it's more than that, because sometimes when someone would ask me the question, like, what does your practice look like? It's easy to get stuck in labeling and almost like a dogmatic form of thinking of like, well, I do a little bit of this and then I do a bit of that, just so that someone might be able to bridge the understanding. But what I love is you've really made it your own. And I think that it's something that I strive towards. Right. And that's maybe something that you could call it mastery, is actually being able to peel away the layers and the protocols and having to name things and then looking at the deeper principles. Right. And just being able to understand, well, this is what I'm actually trying to do. And for someone who has had a 50-year yoga practice, it's beautiful that you have arrived at that point where you actually know what you are trying to do, and you can then sort of pick and choose. And I can kind of resonate with that a little bit with the rule of breathing. It's like, I think I have a bit more ambition still. So sometimes like, I'm trying to reach this crazy goal of, 5-minute breath hold in the water, or I'm trying to climb up a mountain, or I'm trying to do these things, which is just the phase of life that I'm in. Right? But it is beautiful because when you understand those deeper principles, you can sort of pick and choose, and you can actually create something that's completely your own. And that's freedom, right? Because no one can tell you that, oh no, it's not yours, or take it away from you, or claim that it's been done before, and certainly will probably be done later by somebody else as well. So on that note, I think that one thing I bump into a lot in the world of breathing is exactly that. It's this idea that people have, and people will ask me, so what type of breathing do you teach, right? And then they already in their mind start labeling off the 5 techniques that they've heard of, right? Or that they've already boxed it. They've already said, no, okay, that's that form of breathing, right? That's that technique. Or now that's a yogic thing, or that's a Tibetan thing, or that's a Wim Hof thing, right? All these new ones that are coming out as well. And I've created a couple of ones myself in the last couple of years too, which has actually been really fun. But there's something deeper than that, right? Because all these things do have crossover, and they have perhaps similar origin. I mean, who really knows? What I'm interested in from your perspective, from someone who's been around for quite a while longer, is how do you make sense of that in today's day and age? And how do you see that, the crossover between probably yoga and breathing, which another thing I find pretty interesting is what I was sitting here thinking earlier is like, I think when I talk about breathing and you talk about yoga, like on a deeper spiritual level, we're actually probably talking about the same thing. So I'm trying not to label it, but I'm trying to kind of, I guess what I'm fishing for is a little bit of your experience and how you arrived to that point of freedom, right? And when you perhaps were able to strip back the labels and the layers.
It's funny because a lot of people associate me with yoga, and of course, yoga is a Sanskrit word coming from India, obviously.
Yeah.
But my first connection with posture, movement, breathing, mental control came from my father, who was a free diver, and he taught me a lot. And I don't know where he really learned it from. I suspect that the free diving tradition actually goes back a lot to India from what I've read in different books and things. But his techniques were foremost for me. So I'm not an Indian person, so I might use the word yoga, but in the end, I'm just me.
Yes.
But then after meeting him, I had an amazing interaction when I was only 8, because my father was teaching me from when I was 5-6 years old. When I was 8 years old, I met a man called Basil Brown on a boat. We migrated from Europe to Australia, and we came on the boat from Southampton to Australia. And on the way, we stopped in Cape Town, and we picked up a bunch of people, including this wonderful family. And the father of the family was Basil Brown, who was a Rhodesian at the time, athlete. And he taught me Uddiyana Bandha, Nauli, and Lauliki, these yogic kriyas, which in the Western sense, they talk about Mueller maneuvers and Valsalva maneuvers and, holding the breath out, which is something my father taught me how to do, and then learning how to manipulate the internal organs, and suck them up and rotate them left and right. And this was something I then adopted for the rest of my life, and I still practice daily. So I owe him a lot. And then looking back and talking to his son and his daughter over the many years since he passed away, I've realized that, of course, part of his influence was coming from the Bushmen of South Africa. So yes. And I did look into that, and they had they still have some amazing breath techniques. So, I can't really call it yoga if some of what I'm doing comes from the Kalahari Bushmen. And then after that, in my teenage years, I explored a lot with underwater swimming and doing, funny things underwater, which my father had given me, but then I also explored. And then in my forays in the Australian bushland, I used to do these games where I'd pretend I was swimming underwater, but in the Australian bush. So I'd be crawling through the trees, naked usually, with the idea that if I'm naked, then I can't really hurt the trees, and I don't want them hurting me. Because if you wear thick boots and clothes and you walk through the bush, it's easy just to destroy bushland. So I was very conservation minded. So I wouldn't wear any clothes, and I would just weave through the trees while holding my breath.
Wow.
And this gave me a really interesting perspective, to do how far can I go through the bush, like I could do at the time, maybe 80 meters underwater swimming. So could I go 80 meters through the bushland, weaving through trees while holding my breath and ending up in these funny positions? That had quite a pronounced effect on me. Nowadays people talk a lot about doing animal movements and stuff like this. This was fun for me as a teenager. Then in my late teens, I met a Tibetan Lama. And he was in Australia for a while, and I, met him every week for about a year. And he gave me a lot of really interesting techniques, which were Tibetan techniques. Then after that, because of his influence, I started doing some Hatha yoga in Australia, but I wasn't really inspired by it. And I left it. I went to the gym instead and did a couple of years of training, conventional Western training. And around the same time, I injured myself in a number of different ways. And my physiotherapist at the time said, if you want to, you try this exercise. And it helped my knees at the time. And I said, you have more exercises like this? And they said, come to my stretch class. So I went to their stretch class, and then it was quite good. I learned some stretching. And then one week they were missing the class. So the gym that they were working for decided they had to get a replacement, and they got yoga teacher to replace the stretch teacher. And the yoga teacher was this amazing person who'd learned from BKS Iyengar in India. And I suddenly realized that these stretches had so much more in them. So within a year or so, I went to India and actually studied with Iyengar. And in the meantime, I met a couple of other super yogis in Australia, one of whom, he's still alive, his name is Professor Bim. And Professor Bim was like the ultimate super yogi. He could do incredible techniques with his breath, including breath retentions, where he would allow himself to be lying on a bed of nails and then have a steamroller roll over him, or, incredible feats of strength. He would put like a spear tip into his throat and then bend the metal bar attached to the spear, which my Chinese teachers later showed me as well.
It's
And then
interesting
also
that
he would,
you call those breathing related techniques.
yes, incredible, like,
Yeah.
he would use intra-abdominal pressure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you inhale diaphragmatically and
Yeah.
you want to, like, one of the exercises that I do in yoga is Mayurasana.
Mm.
And Mayurasana is, you basically, it looks like a Western gymnastic planche, where you put your elbow against your abdominal cavity, and you would
Yeah.
do either with two hands or with one
Yeah.
hand,
Yeah.
and then balance on the arms, but the abdomen is fully relaxed when you
Right.
do it with yoga. And what allows you to benefit from it is that with the relaxed abdomen, you can dig your elbow right into your internal organs and massage it while inhaling to that part. And then you notice also that the intra-abdominal pressure is actually able to lift you up into the air. And so
Mm.
intra-abdominal pressure is very, very powerful. And
Yeah.
you can use it, also to, with mastery, you can breathe into your throat. Like for most people, if they were to put their fingers in their throat, it just feels uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, you can't even tighten muscles there, but you can, with control, breathe into your throat. And if I breathe into my throat, I'm not like my, Indian yoga teacher or my Chinese yoga teachers who can actually bend metal bars. But I could certainly, one of the tricks I used to do was have someone sit on a chair and put their fingers against my throat, and then I'd push them around the room, with their fingers into my throat, which is uncomfortable for most people. But by learning how to put the intra-abdominal pressure, make it intrathoracic pressure, and then make it pressure that comes into your neck, you can actually then generate power from this.
Oh,
And
fascinating.
he was such a master, this Professor Bim. He could bring the pressure into intraocular pressure. And he would
Wow.
put a metal bar thicker than his thumb, which you cannot bend over your thigh as a normal person. And, it's about 2 meters long. And he'd put one end against his eyeball, the other end against the wall, and then breathe, hold his breath, generate all the pressure to his eyeball, and then bend the metal bar. This sort of thing is phenomenal control, but it's not something you can just learn. You have to very, very gently and carefully build up the strength of your blood vessels. Many people in the West work on building up muscle strength,
Yes.
and you can make muscles very strong in 2 weeks. And you can see a noticeable change, but the tendons in your body will take at least 2 months. The bones to get that strong will take at least 2 years. And the blood vessels, they're going to take a long time to develop this strength that's going to enable you to do certain of the breath control exercises that some of the teachers that I've had can do without the risk that you often read about when you read breathing and yoga, and you look on the Medline search, an internet search on the dangers of breath control. You hear about many people who have given themselves strokes, who have died, who have paralyzed themselves, who've had heart attacks, because if they inappropriately hold their breath and over tighten muscles, you can increase the pressure so much that you can rupture blood vessels. If that happens in your heart, you have a heart attack. If it happens in your brain, you get a stroke, you can paralyze an arm. So you have to build up the pressures inside your body very slowly over a period of years before doing certain breath exercises to make them safe enough to do, which is one of the reasons why I'm very cautious teaching breath control. And I'm a little bit wary about some of the teaching that goes on around the world today, because there are many dangers. You're playing with the life force.
Yeah.
So
there's so many interesting things in there. I can't help but think about freediving though,
yes,
sort
yes.
of a modern application of this. And I just last week I was at this beautiful island and we're diving, right? And essentially the amazing thing about freediving, of course, is that it was thought to be completely impossible, right? Like people would dive down to, I think the limit at the time, I think it was a person in the Navy that there was a bet, because the limit was physiologically like sort of set to be that at 30 meters of depth, you will implode. right? And this might
Yes.
have been in the 1920s or 30s. And then he took a bet for like maybe $1,000 at the time, and he swam down on a single breath of air to like 35 meters, right? And showed that actually he was totally fine. And then from then on, it's been this quest to, you know, the limits of human potential, really. And then again, like at 50 meters, the doctors were like, oh no, if you go to 60, like it's done. It's
Yes.
and
Yes.
deeper and deeper and deeper. And at the moment, like people are diving to 130 meters, like self-propelled, which is just an incredible feat of development. But what's so interesting, and this comes back to mountaineering as well. Again, these are two areas that I'm so deeply fascinated by, is that you will never, I mean, there's actually a story about this, but there was a freediver, it's quite an unfortunate story, who passed away. And essentially what happened, many things happened, but he went too quick, too fast. And so what you'll see at a freediving competition or with these sort of expert level freedivers is they're all like 35 years and above. And they've all got about 10 years at least of like dedicated adaptation, skin in the game, if you will. But really it's like a 1 meter at a time kind of game to sort of adapt your body to those pressures. And we still don't really know exactly like what that adaptation is, right? Like how is it that, but it must be like the blood vessels developing strength. And even with the altitude is the same, like over time, if you continuously expose the body to a certain type of stress, right, it will adapt and it will sort of mold itself in that direction. And it's just so fascinating, because you'll see some of these freedivers, and what I find interesting, even on the outside, like they look like they've got huge lungs, tiny bellies and tiny arms, and then huge legs. And they're like, they've molded themselves into their sport, right? And it's just how incredible is the human body. But it reminds me of that the strength of the blood vessels and how that can be developed, and well, that is all breath, right? And what I'm hearing from you is that even these tricks of like these feats, right, they're not tricks, but they're incredible feats. Like it is again all breath. Amazing.
Yes, in the world of Indian yoga, they talk about prana, and prana is not actually, it's not actually the air so much. It's to do with force.
Right.
It's to do with energy, and one of those forces or one of those energies is pressure. So developing different pressures inside the body, which in your abdomen, for example, it's intra-abdominal pressure.
Yeah.
So many people, for example, they will, if I'm trying to teach beginners, I will often say, breathe into your abdomen. And I'm trying to do it in a lay instruction way to try and explain to a beginner what I mean. But some people will go, you can't breathe into your abdomen, your lungs are in your chest. And I go, well, what I want you to feel is that it feels like you're breathing your abdomen. But of course, what's happening is your diaphragm's moving downwards, which means then that, you'll create a vacuum-like pressure, which will pull air into your lungs. But the pressure you'll feel will be in your abdomen as the diaphragm descends downwards. It increases intra-abdominal pressure. So intra-abdominal pressure in the world of yoga is called aparna. It's a type of prana, of which they talk about five types of prana. One type is called prana, another type is called apana, and it's to do with the intra-abdominal pressure, for example. But there are other types of prana in yoga, which include the pressure in your blood vessels, the pressure in your different parts of the body, like the pressure in the eyes I was talking about. So this is blood pressure, this is force, and pressure is force per unit of area. And so it's interesting that the word hatha, which is the prefix when we talk about Indian yoga, they often talk about the physical component of Indian yoga called as hatha yoga. And hatha literally means force, and the sounds ha and ta allegorically relate to sun and moon. But actually, like any hieroglyphic type of word, the subunits of a large word are usually related to the whole word. So ha and ta are not really sun and moon, but they relate to heat and the absence of heat, which of course can be generated by high pressure, ha, and low pressure, ta. And so when you have in your body a region of high pressure that will push energy away from that part, including blood, for example, and a region of low pressure, which will pull energy to that part, that actually moves the energy and information through the body. And this circulation of energy and information through the body as a result of creating regions of high and low pressure through posture, movement, breathing, mental control, that's what creates the yoga or union or the meditative state or the zone or the enhanced health, happiness, and longevity that we look for when we practice these things.
Wow. Thank you for breaking that down. It's so elegant. And what I'm one thing I was actually going to ask you about is something that Mark once said to me when we're in New Zealand, and he mentioned that essentially what I heard from it, or what I remember, is that he was part of, or I think he actually set it up. He created a bachelor degree in like well-being, right? And I was like,
Yeah.
that is so fascinating. Like, please tell me more. So if you're going to use a academic approach to well-being, then what does it include, right? So how do you become a you know, a PhD in well-being, right?
Wow.
And he started to tell me all these different areas that they had. And I was like, wow, it sounds like the most amazing program. And apparently some of the people that actually joined the program went on to become amazing authors and just incredible people, right?
It
And then he
was
said, oh, we
such
had
a
Simon
program.
Borg-Olivier teach yoga. And
Oh,
that's actually when I first heard about your name. And so I didn't press too much on the yoga bit. I was really interested in all the other sides. But
mm.
what I was going to ask you is, so if you're going to teach yoga in an academic setting, right? Where do you begin? And then what are you teaching?
It was very challenging. The degree that Mark set up was fascinating. And for me, just going back to what I was saying before about my history, I
Yeah.
I eventually traveled to India and I learned Indian yoga. I also, on the way, learned Japanese yoga. That was where my first teacher training came. So I had influence from Japan, Tibet, India, South Africa, etc. And then I went to India, learned a lot, and I was teaching from the early 80s till, about the early 1990s. And at the same time, I was working as a molecular biologist. I was lecturing in, molecular biology. We were doing gene sequencing, and, which is very interesting in the world of what's happening today, to get the perspective that I have from that's, for me, very interesting.
That must be.
But at the time, I had these two lives, this yoga life, which was very alternative to Western medicine, and I had this science life. And at one point, my university professor said, "You were not at the molecular biology meeting on Tuesday night. Where were you?" And I said, "I was teaching my yoga class." And they said, "That's not good. If you're going to be a serious scientist, you have to quit
Ah,
yoga and be a scientist. So
yes.
you have to choose either yoga or science." And I went, "Bye."
Yeah.
And I didn't, working in a laboratory was not that exciting. So I enjoyed the lecturing and I enjoyed the position at the university, but I left and I had this sense of loss to a certain extent. So after that, I decided somehow I wanted to fuse my understanding from the West and the East. So for various reasons, I chose to become a physiotherapist. So I
Right.
went back to university as for my third degree, became an exercise-based physiotherapist. And then along the way, people asked me, about what's this funny thing that you do at the same time? Because people used to see that occasionally I'd, not go to the pub and drink with everyone else, but I'd be eating watermelons and standing on my head. And they wondered why. So gradually the university lecturers also noticed that I was doing strange things. And I had some interesting, things to contribute, especially when it came to the cadaver lab and the anatomy lab. And I started showing them the things that you can do with your muscles of breathing. They
Right.
were like
Yeah.
aghast.
Yeah.
We didn't even know this was possible, that
Things
they
like the
could do
Naui
these things.
Kriya again,
Yes,
and
yes.
yeah,
They just didn't
breath
understand.
vacuums, and wow.
Yes. Now they're better understood, still not fully understood,
Yeah.
but at the time they were complete mysteries. This is the early 1990s. So with that, then I started lecturing at conferences after I finished physiotherapy from about 1996, 1997. Myself and my business partner, Bianca Matchless, who also became a physiotherapist and also had studied in India with me with various teachers. So we created this company called Yoga Synergy, where we're creating a synergy, a fusion between our understanding as traditional yoga practitioners, but also as Western-based medical, scientists, exercise-based physiotherapists. And she was also a microbiologist. And, so we had this fusion. And along the way, we decided we were going to write a book to validate the studies that we've done in India. So from the early 1990s, we began writing a draft of a book, which took 15 years before we actually published it. and it was called The Applied Anatomy and Physiology of Yoga, actually 10 years to publish it. And the Applied Anatomy and Physiology of Yoga was the book that had 380 references, scientific literature and stuff like this. And Mark Cohen picked up this book in 2005 or 2006. And then he approached me and said, look, this would be a great book to use as a textbook for a course that I'm now about to launch at RMIT University. Would you like to come and lecture in the course? So the first course we taught was called Eastern Applied Anatomy and Physiology. And the university didn't like this. They said, why would Eastern anatomy be different to Western anatomy? So we changed the name to the Applied Anatomy and Physiology of Yoga. And this was the name we used for a while. But it was a very technical course, because, and really the level of people who were doing it were not really able to get it, because the university allowed us to teach the course to the Masters of Wellness, which he created.
Yeah.
And the Master of Wellness was a fairly small degree. We had subjects like the ones I taught, but we also had wonderful subjects which Mark had organized, like energy medicine, mind-body medicine, mind-body psychology, and a whole bunch of other amazing subjects. But
such a number of time.
Really cool, So, and it was a wonderful university. Most of it was online, but I had some great, retreats where we all workshopped all of this with the other wonderful practitioners and lecturers. But the university was constantly on us, is this science? Is energy medicine science?
Yeah.
And so they were constantly pressuring us. And so we had to make it highly technical, but there was only usually each year, maybe 10 or 15 master's students. And that didn't justify the actual expenditure. So we also, sold our courses to undergraduates. And my course, which was at the time the Applied Anatomy Physiology of Yoga, was a great course for the postgraduates, because it was highly technical, and we did it like, university graduates. I had already a master's, which I'd written a 500-page thesis for, research-based masters. And so I wrote it like a science textbook. But that was fine for the master's graduates. But most of our students were undergraduates who thought that, we could do the easy version of the course. We made two versions, a high-level version for the masters, a simpler version for the undergraduates. But nevertheless, it was still too technical. So Mark said, could you write another course where it just breaks it down even simpler? So we wrote a course called Yoga Fundamentals. And this was the essence of the philosophy of yoga, what people could practice on a simple level, how it relates to things like inversions, breath control, meditation. And we wrote this very, very good course. And instantly at the university, it became a hit, especially with the undergraduates. I mean, the master's people loved it as well. But we were having the largest selection of students coming to any subject at the university at the time. It was like 200 people a semester over a 10-year period that we ran the course. And this was fantastic. And so we actually thought we would launch it in the world as well. Yeah. But funnily enough, when you launch a subject at university on yoga, it became very, very popular. But launching the same subject online to the general populace, everyone goes, well, I've done the fundamentals of yoga. But our fundamentals of yoga were very different to other people's fundamentals. They were the fundamentals that most people didn't realize, such as the essence of breathing, for example, like, it's actually more useful to learn how to breathe less than it is how to breathe more. For most people, and that most people are already breathing too much. Yeah. These things most of the yoga population doesn't realize. Yeah. So we taught this, and but I had to simplify it a lot to make it for the undergraduates. But nevertheless, it was a really, really good thing to teach for the postgraduates as well. But in the end, Mark's degree was not really that well received by the university itself. They started to say, is it really science? Can you really back it? And of course, there was lots of science background, but they wanted randomized controlled trials. They wanted peer review studied of randomized controlled trials. And there's only so much that you can do when you're talking about individuals. We published one paper on our yoga fundamentals, but, how can you control two people? How can you give them the same exercise, expect them to actually receive it the same way? So the studies on drugs can be randomized and controlled to a certain extent. Even that's questionable science in my books. But the university in the end shut down the program. And I think part of it was because they thought it wasn't scientific enough. But really it was. It was actually very, very good.
It's
It's a shame.
I'd love to pick your brain a little bit on this actually,
Mm.
because we at every training we do, we bring about 200 scientific papers to the training, right? And you could indeed start arguing whether they are meta-analysis or control.
Yes,
But
yes.
beyond that, it's like, okay, here's the papers, right? And what's so interesting as well is with some of these papers, like at the end of the paper, the conclusion is actually always really interesting, but it's always also, but we need more. Very few of these papers will not end by saying, but
Yes.
we need more.
Yes,
Right. And there was an amazing study in Brisbane that I was just like going through. And then I've actually started to love reading these and then picking them apart and even having a chat to some of the people that were involved in it and stuff. And it showed that, using breathing less, right? Like Buteyko technique, essentially, people could get relief from asthma, right? They could drop their medication in the
I
space
think I
of a few
remember that
months.
paper.
I
Yeah.
think it was 100% successful, it actually, and it was like, but we need more studies. And it was like, why? And then there was another paper in England that sort of very similar result. And it was like, but we need more studies. And so you've got the succession of 7 of these papers. And so what's really interesting is it's actually a dead end. Like that idea that, science is going to bring us the answer and it's going to validate our practices and what we know. I think you can run around and chase that carrot for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've seen something similar with yoga. I mean, I don't actually know, but there must be endless papers on yoga today. There must be so much research on it.
There are many papers on yoga, but really, if you say to someone, does yoga work?
Yeah.
What is their impression? What do they call yoga? Even if you give people 2 similar postures or 2 similar breathing exercises, which muscles are they voluntarily activating? Which muscles are coming on as a result of their unnatural modern lifestyle? How natural is their body? How unnatural is their body based on their lifestyle? What age are they? Who taught them? How were they taught? How are they doing it? There's very few situations where you can give people an exercise and even expect them to do it the same, let alone, have it been taught the same way.
And how do you quantify the results, right?
It's very difficult to quantify the results. I mean, I'm working on it. I've been given a research grant recently by what's called the Yoga for Good Foundation. It was a very generous $10,000 grant to buy equipment for myself to do research. And maybe at some point you and I could liaise on this, because predominantly I like to work with breath control, but also things like heart rate variability, pulse oximetry. I also want to get myself another better capnometer and, things like this. I'm finding it's difficult to work on things like muscles, but with Mark Cohen at RMIT University, we did do some really interesting preliminary studies on blood flow. Not so much muscle tone, on blood flow, where we actually, used a very high quality infrared video camera where you could videotape. Mainly it was me at the time being used as a subject, and you saw me begin my practice, and you'd see in the video camera that my hands, for example, were very cold at the start and all the heat was centralized in the trunk. But then as the practice progressed, then you see my hands becoming extremely hot, just the same temperature as my core. And then I could show things like, for example, with a closed fist, that will push blood away from my wrist. But if I lengthen the fingers, blood comes toward the wrist. And, for example, if I stand and I do it like a little side bend, so the left side of my trunk becomes firm, the right side is fully relaxed. If I bend the other way, this side becomes firm, the other side is relaxed and lengthened. And so what happens is with blood flow, the side that's compressed and tense, that temperature drops down to like 32 degrees. But the side that's expanded, lengthened, and relaxed becomes instantly 37 degrees. When I say instantly, as I do this movement like that, within 3 seconds, you see on a thermographic image, 32 degrees, 37. 3 seconds later, 32 degrees, 37. And so you can make blood flow very quickly through your body. You can change the temperature very quickly by learning how to activate and relax certain muscles and compress and expand different regions. And what Mark and I wrote together was a paper which we never actually published, but we've used it for various reasons. We did intend to publish it. We will eventually. It's called The 12 Different Ways That You Move Blood Through the Body, only one of which is the heart, but the other 11 ways of moving blood through the body and essentially moving energy and information through all the channels of the body, including, lymphatic vessels, nerves, acupuncture meridians, acellular flow of energy as well, are coming through 12 different systems, only one of which is the heart. But the other methods, some of them are well known in modern science, such as the musculoskeletal pump, the respiratory pump, a gravitational pump. But there are other more hidden methods, which are part of the secrets of hatha yoga and the various different types of yoga under different names, of course, such as the teachings of the traditional movements and postures and breathing control exercises of Japan and China. I had a really good connection with China the last 25 years, and I've had some amazing influences from China. And so then trying to understand my teachings from China, India, Japan, Tibet, the indigenous culture of South Africa, of Australia as well. I've had some wonderful teachers from here, from South America, and putting them all together with my understanding as an exercise-based physiotherapist. Now I feel like I'm getting some idea of what's going on in the body. Slowly. It's a big job,
I love hearing that after everything you've just shared, and then me sitting here, thinking, I think I'm starting to get there as well. But then actually like turning it around and going, what a wonderful adventure is ahead, right? I mean, it's just so exciting. Yeah, really interesting what you shared about the temperature. I used to play around because I do a lot of cold exposure. And actually, when you set your 8-degree temperature pool, I was like, okay, I'd love to have a chat.
Yeah, I'm sure you would. It's never been.
Yeah, no, interesting. And even I do something called Watsu as well. Have you heard of that? Like water shiatsu.
Watsu, I love.
Using shiatsu in warm water. That's fantastic. And
yeah,
I'm really, and of course the relationship with Mark was all about bathing in hot springs and what that can do for the human body, and actually, of course, really interesting. I love reading into the different gases and mineral compositions of hot springs, and these have been healing places since the dawn of time, right? Like, that if you have asthma, you go to the hot spring, it can actually go away, right? And that was ancient. And it's the same for eczema and all these different conditions, perhaps with similar origins. But what was really interesting because I used to use these infrared cameras. So you could buy one. It was my friend had a phone that was a special construction phone, and he gave it to me for a while. It had this really nice like infrared camera on there. I guess, these things are becoming more and more available.
I want to buy another one. So maybe you can tell me later on where you got it from, because
yeah. It's a specific brand of cellular phone, and it has all these gadgets that someone in construction would use, right? Like lasers and all that stuff. And so anyway, we would do ice baths just in my garage at home. And so we would sit in a 0-degree tub, sitting still essentially, and then we would get out and then we would try all these different movements to see what would bring warmth throughout the body, right? And one of the people that I spent a bit of time with and used to work a lot with as well is Wim Hof. And actually quite interesting because a couple of the movements that he so popularized, right, or that he's kind of like, they're sort of his iconic moves, or at least that people associate it with him. One of them was actually Mayurasana as well. Standing in these movements, like doing it in snowy conditions and stuff like that, which looks really amazing. But also movements like the Chinese horse stance, right? Yeah, it was a funny quote I saw, which was like, horse stance used to cure ADD since 200 before Christ. So again, super old stuff, but it was really interesting trying all these different moves after your body is, like starting to open up its blood vessels again, and then seeing what would influence that circulation. And actually what was also fascinating was more interested in the breathing side of things myself. And of course that I think sometimes still a little known fact that circulation is largely increased by respiration, right? So essentially like carbon dioxide, I think, is one of the primary vasodilators, and also nitric oxide, right? Which are two things that you can actually regulate through your breath. So I was going to ask you about that, but it's something that I see a lot, and it's a lot of people walk around, and especially like females will come into these classes and say, I have Raynaud's. And it's like, okay, most likely what's actually happening is that there's poor circulation. And then, I mean, there could be so many things going on, but what I find an interesting thing to always try is, okay, let's work on breathing less, right? And actually an interesting kind of thing to show people, like, am I breathing less, is, well, are your hands warmer, right? Or is there saliva on the mouth? Because of course the sympathetic nervous system also is involved in temperature regulation. But yeah, super interesting. Not sure if there was a question in there.
No, that's good.
I love
if I can comment firstly that Wim Hof is an amazing guy. I had the pleasure of him ringing me up one time when I was in India, and it was a surprise random call, and he rang with the idea that maybe we could liaise. He'd heard of me, and we could maybe do a training together, where I teach part of the yoga, he teach parts of the breath. And in the end, it didn't work out because we were in the wrong time and place. But it was just so lovely talking to him. And so I really, I've never met him in person, but, I love the passion that he shares. But to me, it's sad that he's been a little bit misunderstood.
Yeah.
And that some people, the nature of humanity is always a bit funny. Yeah. People will see a technique, they take the tiniest part of it and they assume they've learned the technique. And so a lot of people who went to his training, for example, only got that you're supposed to hyperventilate. That's it. Yeah. They miss the fact that that you have to actually balance that with a bit of breath retention afterwards, a significant amount of breath retention. That's often been a misunderstanding that I thought was a shame. And it happens whenever anything is popularized. Yeah. And taught en masse to a certain extent. The other thing was that he had this science-based backing to his work. And as you were saying, the science-based backing was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they observed was that using his technique, for example, when I think he did it with 25 people, where he taught the technique, and 25 people were acting control, and then they inoculated everyone with something that was going to elicit some sort of immune system response. And they saw that the immune system didn't kick off the response in the people he trained, but they, did kick it off in the people he hadn't trained. So the conclusion was loosely that his technique was going to suppress an immune response. But the conclusion wasn't really, definitive. But it went all around the world. But really, if I'd read that paper, I would have gone, okay, so he seems to have done something which has suppressed the immune response. Did he actually do something to enhance immunity, or just switch off the immune system entirely? Because it's possible that both may happen. Maybe, for example, with Wim himself, who is a master yogi in my books, and, who probably, I don't know how long his breath retention is after he hyperventilates, but, I know for myself, I could easily do 6.5 minute breath retention. In fact, I did with Mark Cohen one time. We did hyperventilation, and then I held my breath for 6.5 minutes. After that, according to the computer, which I was strapped to with a gas mask around my face, apparently when I sat there for what to me seemed like a few seconds, my the computer reading the gases coming in and out of my body based on a gas mask connected to my face, it said that I didn't breathe at all for 8.5 minutes. After my conscious breath retention, 6.5 minutes, which at the time seemed without forcing because I'd hyperventilated first. Then apparently I didn't breathe at all for 8.5 minutes. And this was the most beautiful, most peaceful state of meditative bliss I've ever had in my life. Difficult to get to. I suspect that when Wim does his training, he also, will hold his breath for at least 5 or 6 minutes. But most of the practitioners I know who have tried his technique will only hold the breath after their hyperventilation for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. If I hold my breath for even 4.5 minutes, it is not enough to elicit a good response from me, and I will be left feeling a bit unbalanced. So I feel that more people need to realize the benefits, not just of hyperventilation, not just of breath retention, but what Wim is doing is something which is a combination of the both, taking two extremes, like Tantra takes two extremes, and then coming to the unity, the yoga that comes after them. And I believe that he may actually be enhancing his immune system when he does it himself. But it's possible that other people may just be putting themselves into sympathetic dominance by hyperventilating, not balancing it enough, and then in a sympathetic dominant state, a person who, for example, is stressed at work, doesn't get sick, but the day they go on holiday and relax, that's when the sickness comes. Absolutely. So it's possible that someone who hyperventilates and does what they think is a Wim Hof technique, but is only part of what Wim actually offers in his greatness, may actually be just turning off their immune system. Yeah. And so this is something which the science paper explored very loosely at the end, and it's mentioned in the paper, but not really explored and not really followed up. But of course, the mainstream press.
No, I actually really agree with everything that you shared, and One thing
It's
that
good to
always
share with me.
really
Thank
comes
you.
to mind with this too, I mean, I studied the technique extensively, and when I say studied, is I mean, of course, I read all the papers and spent the time with Wim, but really, I kind of had this opportunity to like in person teach it to about 10,000 people actually over the years. I went, I went all in, right, and I saw some really
Wow.
interesting
Good,
things, and
good.
that sort of started informing my questions. And also that was part of the reason why I was so interested in working with Mark at the time, because I thought he was one of the few people that would actually be able to answer some of these deepest questions, which Wim also, like he offers, like you said, in his greatness, the energy, but not necessarily
No,
this sort of approach
I
of
think,
learning that I was really interested in, and also kind of
yes.
potentially the pitfalls around that. But what something that really comes up without going too deep into it is that both yourself and Wim bring an incredible foundation to this, right? And you could call it a yoga foundation, which you know, Wim was also practicing yoga at a very early age, and so
Nice.
you know, you're both looking at potentially 40 years of practice before you bring in those techniques, right? Or potentially you've also adapted to those techniques along the way, as you shared with us earlier, because again, it's contraction, relaxation, right? So your system is very adapted to that, and so the responses are going to also be different to someone that's going to walk off the street and try the technique straight up. But what is really interesting, of course, is, I mean, I think the paper was actually named voluntary activation of the sympathetic nervous system, right? And so that was essentially the bigger thing that the scientists took out of it. I know that the world took something very different out of it, right? That they chose to, but essentially that was it. It's like, okay, so it's kind of heart proof, or it's a step towards heart proof that indeed by using your breath you can indeed like regulate the autonomic nervous system in that sense, right? Which is, I mean, even that notion is actually not so crazy when you think about it, because I mean, I think you're regulating the autonomic nervous system with everything you do, right? Like when you eat, you regulate the autonomic nervous system. When you don't eat, you regulate the autonomic
Yes,
nervous
yes.
system, right? And so when you move, when you don't move, when you breathe, when you don't breathe, and when you breathe really fast, you're going to dump a bunch of adrenaline into the system, right? Which is going to suppress immunity, and that I think is actually probably the key takeaway from it. And then how to harness and use that. I mean, that they are trying at the moment actually to sort of see, but what I think has happened with the research, especially in the last 2 years, because those same scientists have taken that and gone on a beautiful process with it of continued research. But there was a really interesting paper which was actually looking at, I can't remember exactly what condition it was, but it was an autoimmune condition, and people that were, you know, that had significant strain, like mentally, physically, emotionally, from having that condition, and they found incredible relief from doing the exercise. So I found that was really interesting. It's like, okay, so essentially by these people bringing in a breathwork practice, right, or a form of yoga, let's just say, they are finding like a greater mental health, resilience, strength, and that's of course really beautiful. And whether it's because of the immune system or not, like you could go so nitty gritty with it, but ultimately it doesn't really matter, you know, the fact that it's helped so many people. And what I also find quite interesting is it hasn't harmed that many people. There have certainly been cases and conditions, and you know, there's a lot of work has been done in terms of the contraindications and things like that, but it's remarkably safe. Both the, you know, the jumping in really cold water, which of course is also as old as time itself, but also the breathing exercises. It is actually remarkably safe, as you know, the millions of case studies anecdotal have sort of come to show us. Super interesting. So one thing I am hoping to about is really when it comes to the world of breathing, and I hate the term dysfunctional breathing, actually. I mean, that's the scientific term for it, right? It's like, it's dysfunctional breathing. I'd always talk about, and this I like to call it, restoring the natural flow of breath, right? Because that's all that we're doing, is that the body knows how to breathe perfectly, right? Babies do. And then things along the way happen, and it comes to disturb our natural flow. And then like my task is to restore that. So sometimes that just means like removing the stressors, right? But what is also interesting is that sometimes just removing the stressors is actually not enough. Like you actually, I've come to see, require some form of breath practice, right? To bring things back to baseline, back to, and that's actually why I'm so passionate about this, is because I think we also face significant stress in life. And so we've all had our breath taken away, right? We've all been impacted by that. And so all of us can potentially benefit from having some form of breathing practice, because yeah, it's really necessary for optimal health, for homeostasis, right? Like you could make it as complex and as simple as you want to.
100%. Yeah.
But one thing that's really interesting, and this is something I'd love to ask you about, is I will sometimes have a lot of yoga teachers in my classes, right? And then I know that I have to be tread on careful water because essentially there's a lot of different, and you've actually alluded to this already, but there's a lot of different ways that yoga is being taught that are very contradictory to the idea that yoga is, here to help you breathe better. It can actually do the opposite. So like, just to be very frank about it, one of the things that I've put in our, like, this is the book that I wrote on breathing, right? There's a list of things that can potentially disrupt your flow of breathing, let's just say. And the list is extensive. It could be drinking too much coffee, right? It could be not sleeping right. But one of the things is actually not like doing an imbalanced breathing practice. And I put yoga and Pilates and all sorts of things that people think are going to help with their breathing in that category. And so it's really quite confronting for people sometimes. And I find I'm always not the right person to communicate it, because I kind of have been hanging around this idea for a very long time, right? This notion that, no, actually, you don't learn to breathe well in yoga. In fact, in the kind of circles that I associate with sometimes, it's even known that you got to be careful when you go to yoga, that you don't end up doing some of these mouth breathing practices and things like that. Like you sort of have to sit in the back of the class and just be with your own breath, because you could potentially not come out well. Does that make sense?
100%.
Yeah. And it's,
I often don't talk about myself as a
yoga
yoga teacher because it's misunderstood. Often I'd rather not be called a yoga teacher, because many people who have an understanding of the body will go, no, yoga's stupid, because they've been shown modern yoga. And traditional yoga is highly advanced and very intelligent, but most modern yoga classes to me are a combination of over tensing, over stretching, over breathing, overthinking when actually they should turn their mind off, or underthinking when actually they should be a bit more careful. Often it's a lot of those things. So I'm not that impressed with the way most modern yoga is taught. Let's face it, if something is taught to the level of pseudo mastery within 1 month, how much can you learn, I did,
which is very true for breathing as well. It's
exactly.
Very, very true for, I think, for most things. Okay, so then if we go back a little bit, because again, I find it hard to like lift the veil on what is yoga, essentially, right? The way I sort of see it, and I've done a couple of yoga teacher trainings actually. One of them was in India. I had a great time, brilliant. But one of the things I sort of see in my understanding of it is that essentially, and sometimes I feel like when I teach the world of breathing, right, because I talk about, look, we can look at the whole world of breathing, and I sort of sometimes say, from where I understand it, it starts in about the 1960s. That's when Witeko was sort of getting out with his techniques, and on the other side of the spectrum, we have people like Stanislav Grof coming out with the over breathing techniques, and it's also when we've had people like Patanjali Joyce and Iyengar, who you mentioned, and also the founders of Hatha around that time sort of create that system of yoga that we practice today. And from what I can see, they created most of the breathing techniques that we practice today when we talk about pranayama and yoga, right? So I sometimes go, like, let's just begin here, because whatever happened before then, like, I don't know. Like, I find it very hard to see what breathing practices were used in yoga and which weren't. And so it's almost like you have this stop. Am I sort of correct in saying
yes, you're right. It's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. So can I give you my take in that case?
I really would love to, because I find it super
like
interesting.
you alluded to this notion of Buteyko, whose general concept is breathe less. Someone like Stanislav Grof, who finished his LSD studies because it became illegal to work with LSD, so he tried to create some sort of similar effect with the body through hyperventilation and essentially breathing more. So one of the things with yoga is that they sort of combine them to a certain extent. Like BKS Iyengar is very much about just breathe naturally in his practice. That's what he taught. And, I liked his approach to pranayama because he mostly taught natural breathing in posture. He also mostly taught that when we're doing breath control, he taught the most simplest breath control most of the time. A lot of it was just supine, abdominal breathing, a little bit of chest expansion. It was grossly misunderstood still, but it was very, very simple practices. Very little hyperventilation at all. Then Patabi Joyce was also, in my view, a master of what he did. His English wasn't good. Unfortunately, Patabi Joyce taught Ashtanga Yoga, and Ashtanga Yoga is this quite complex sequence of very difficult postures for most modern adults to do. And he said what we need to do is observe his sequence. We need to observe what he called drishti, which is the place that you look at in each posture. There's a place for the eyes to gaze to. You have to also observe Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, which was never specified exactly what it was, but I'll talk about that later. And then we also had to do what he called Ujjayi Pranayama in every part of the practice.
Mm-hmm.
And that was grossly misunderstood. Effectively, when you really study what he did, recognize that he came from the same teacher as Iyengar, who was teaching Breathe Less. When you
Okay.
really checked out what both of them were doing and studied it at length, which myself and Bianca, my business partner, did,
And that
you
was that
realize
Krishnamurti, the
Krishna
teacher?
Macharya. Krishna Macharya was the
Krishnamacharya.
teacher of both Iyengar, Patabi Joyce, and his
Yeah.
own son, Desika Cha,
Yeah.
and also Indra Devi and a number of other people as well. But when you really see how this got misunderstood and misused in the West, it's quite sad, because Iyengar was very precise about his instructions. And in any one posture, he might give you 300 different points. And we would teach one posture in 3 hours very methodically. And you'd get a very good result with that one posture.
Yeah.
But most modern people, is too complex, too much thinking, and too boring to learn for 3 hours.
Yeah,
It's
I spent 2 days in India once learning the shoulder stand, and
a
I only
lot of
got
stuff.
through maybe the first section of it, and I was like,
Yes.
okay.
And then with Patabi Joyce, what he offered was a sequence which initially was taught to young Brahmin kids.
Right.
And you learn, 50 or 60 postures and do it over a couple of hours, and you flow. And for me, when I first learned that sequence, I was like 24 years old. I'd already done, 5 years of exhaustive, Iyengar yoga, studied with Iyengar many times, and pretty much mastered every pose in his book as postures. And when I first started doing Ashtanga yoga, my teacher actually said these words, which when I showed her the Ashtanga practice, and she also was very adept, I said, so how was it for you? She said, well, it was very interesting. She said, up until now, doing all the Iyengar style practice, the yoga for me was like getting up in the morning, going out into the garage, getting into my car, checking the tire pressure first, checking the oil, turning on the engine, revving it a little bit. She said, today with the Ashtanga practice, it felt like it was the first time I actually went for a drive. And so the Ashtanga practice was not thinking, but just getting in the body and doing dynamic meditation. And it was a beautiful thing. And this Ashtanga practice had something really good. So myself and my business partner realized that the Iyengar system was good. The Ashtanga system was good. Iyengar was too complex. Ashtanga was too difficult. So let's try and fuse something together, which would be more accessible versions of the postures, taught with the enough sort of guided instruction that would get people doing them safely. That system we called yoga synergy, but along the same lines, many other people had the same idea in the late 90s, and then even more so in the 2000s, where they fused it and they called it something like vinyasa flow.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with the vinyasa flow, they lost the key points of Patabi Joyce's system and the key points of understanding of what Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha was and Ujjayi was. And when you really apply the system that Patabi Joyce had, you ended up where breath control was very effortless and very minimal.
Right.
But when you misunderstood it and superimposed erroneous ideas of physiotherapy and Pilates, which now even the physiotherapists and Pilates teachers realize were erroneous. Things like, tighten the pelvic floor, draw the navel to the spine, deep breath into the chest, open the heart center, and stuff like this. That's what suddenly crept into modern yoga in the late 90s. And, for example, very loosely, if you apply the bandhas, which are these co-activations of opposing muscles in the different joint complexes, including the lower trunk and the upper trunk, which are where your muscles of breathing are, then the best way of holding your abdomen and your chest for doing things like handstands and postures would be to have the chest compressed and the abdomen expanded but firm. But instead, most people went for the look, which is the abdomen very narrow and wasted, and the chest very expanded. But that does not give you strength. It actually then inhibits the diaphragm for most people who do it that way, and it causes hyperventilation, weakness, and risk on the lower back. And so, unfortunately, this loss of the original Ashtanga sequence by many people, because of course some people still do Ashtanga Vinyasa and they do a fairly good job of practicing it, but not many people actually teach it compared to what's mostly taught in the world. And so what happened was a misunderstanding that caused most people to misunderstand the bandhas, misunderstand the breathing, and they're just basically overusing a lot of the muscles of breathing in a way which is just inhibiting the diaphragm, which disconnects you with your unconscious, and causing hyperventilation, which overstimulates the nervous system, essentially putting most people into a state of dominant flight or fight.
Yeah.
And it's not so good for the physical body either, the way they're doing it.
Yeah.
When done correctly, the Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga should be such that every breath starts diaphragmatically, moves through the rest of the body. And the key that I take from it and I try and give to my students is that you are trying to do two things with the breath for optimum health. Number one is learn how to breathe as little as possible while doing as much as possible, in the same way that an elite athlete is dictated to be a fit person if they can run fast and not breathe much. And a person who walks slowly going, that's considered a sick person because they're breathing too much for doing too little. So what we want is to emphasize breathe as little as possible, but it's really useful for the physical, physiological, and mental body if you can really master the control of your muscles of breathing. So can you learn how to look like you're taking full breath in and full breath out without actually breathing? And that is the secret of yogic kriya and the understanding of mudra, where you're learning how to use every muscle of breathing, but not necessarily taking much air in or out.
Fascinating.
The combination is very rarely taught.
Yeah. And one thing that just came to mind as well, I don't know if you've ever heard of William Trubridge. He's the New Zealand freediving champion.
Beautiful man.
Yeah, and he's actually like to be considered like the best of the best because he doesn't use any equipment, right? He uses only his body.
Yeah,
no
free,
fins, no weights, no nothing. So the most
no fins, no weights. I worked with him in the Bahamas a couple of times. I went to the Bahamas with
so
him.
one thing
He
that I have,
he had me teaching yoga. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, okay. So one thing that I found really fascinating, and I've again, someone who I've been through all of his books and all of his lectures, is that he actually uses the bandhas on the water. And he's one of the only freedivers that have heard speak about this, that he will use the bandhas as an energy control system whilst holding his breath on the water in the pressure. I can already tell that
we work together in the Bahamas, and I really respect William as a guru on all levels. He's a beautiful man. He's a really amazing guy, and incredible strength of spirit and passion. One of the things that that I do related to that is that when you hyperventilate, you can hold the breath for an incredibly long period of time because your need to use the diaphragm is diminished, and so you don't get that sort of contraction that you're going to suffocate. Your diaphragm stops fluttering. But of course, you would not hyperventilate before going underwater. It's too dangerous. So what most free divers do, as you are well aware, of course, is that you learn how to control that diaphragmatic and just go, oh, my diaphragm's fluttering. Whereas other people would go, my diaphragm's telling me, breathe. You're going, oh, my diaphragm's fluttering. I've still got 5 minutes before I'm going to die. It's something like that. So one of the things that I do is I actually control the diaphragm. I take control of it. So I'll make the diaphragm and the chest move in like doing pretend controlled full inhale and exhale while holding my breath. And that actually then takes control of the fluttering. And I have a lot more ability to hold my breath by actually moving my diaphragm up and down consciously, by actually moving my chest muscles, and actually not just breathing from the front of my body, but breathing from my spine as well. So I'll expand my pelvic floor, my lower back, my upper back, my chest, my abdomen. Then I contract my lower abdomen, my lower back, upper back, my chest, my abdomen. And throughout inhalation and exhalation, I can feel my diaphragm descending in a wave like squid-like fashion, and then ascending. And so it's actually not just going back and forth, but it's making this wave-like contraction that comes from breathing up the spine and down the front as well. And that controls this thing. I think William is probably doing something very, very similar in his practice at a higher level, much higher level.
Yeah.
is amazing.
Sometimes when I hold my breath in the water, we do something called a static breath hold, which is of course this idea of I mean, sometimes similar to your static meditation practice perhaps, but you lay with your face in the water and you just, no hyperventilation, so you just hold your breath as long as you can. And when I start holding my breath, the moment I start holding my breath actually, and I've since accentuated this, not really knowing what is happening but just going with it, I'm still breathing. So of course I'm very in tune with listening to the contractions and feeling the first kind of responses, because those are all things that we use in breath practice as indicators, right? But actually what's been really interesting is the more subtle layer, that the moment I stop holding my breath, my breathing system continues. And so I noticed that my diaphragm continues, it's really subtle, but it continues to pull down and go up in much the same rhythm that I was breathing in the practice. And it's only because I'm so still and there's nothing else, it's sensory deprivation, that I'm in tune with it. But since feeling it in the water, and what I would do is I would tell myself I can breathe on the water, right?
Yes,
So when I
yes,
feel
it's a
I'm
really good
breathing
thing
on
to
the
do. I
water.
do the same.
I don't know if I've actually shared this with people before, but I've since made it a practice. I tell myself I feel that very subtle rhythm, and I go, no, actually, I have gills, like I am breathing,
Yeah,
I'm moving it, and it's very calming.
yeah.
So I mean, very interesting, and I'm sure that other people have found something similar. But there's like layers of these
Yeah.
contractions that happen, and essentially, like your breathing system never stops, is what I've since come to learn. But I haven't really found any information about what may be going on there.
I think that's the key, to make sure that the diaphragm does not switch off. It's one of the worst things that people do, and often people do it in modern yoga. Their diaphragm either gets stuck either
Yeah.
too high up or too low down.
Like
It's often pulled
hyperinflation.
too
Yeah.
low down because the chronic seated position that many people have
Yeah.
overtensions the psoas muscle, and the psoas muscle attaches to the diaphragm. So when people stand up, their diaphragm is being pulled down into the inhalation position,
Yeah.
which means they can't exhale, which means they can't inhale either.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the big ones. And the other
It's,
one, of course, is they're constantly over tightening their muscles of forced abdominal exhalation, the oblique abdominal muscles in particular, and they act as the antagonists of the diaphragm. So then they functionally, neurologically inhibit their diaphragm and they can't breathe in. And so the combination of these two things stuffs up most people's modern breathing.
That's exactly what I was gonna say to that. Is that's what I think is the most common interpretation of what, like, poor breathing is. And it is a very physical overview, because I think sometimes the biochemical side is not considered in the role that it plays in that. So I can do this for days. Really, I'm already so lit up. But I know that I'm gonna respect your time, and we're gonna cut it here very shortly.
I have to finish. Can I show you one thing? Can I show you my gill?
Yeah. Please.
So this may not be for the general public, but so often what I do is if I stand up and I just show you my abdomen, if from this position, here's my relaxed belly. If I lean back, then my abdomen is firm just with rectus abdominis, but my sides are totally soft. Okay. And so then if I engage just my lower abdomen, you might be able to see this, there's my lower abdomen. So that's like my gills. So what I'm doing is I'm gauging.
That's the lowest part of the diaphragm.
So here, like this is my normal, my relaxed abdomen. If I engage just transverse abdominis there, that's transverse abdominis lower, but notice I'm not tightening anything. It's a very soft contraction.
Yeah.
Doesn't cause tension. And so if I engage, if I lean back, tighten, rectus abdominis is quite firm. That doesn't inhibit my diaphragm. The sides are fully soft. And then I just engage just the lower abdomen. And sometimes it looks like gills. But that control of the lower abdomen, that ability to control the lower abdomen, is fundamental to learning how to make an exhalation which is complete, which does not inhibit the diaphragm. Most people use oblique muscles to exhale. They harden the abdomen, draw the navel to the spine in a way which inhibits the diaphragm. And that means that the next inhalation then is not going to begin diaphragmatically. It's going to begin in the chest and overstimulates the sympathetic nervous system. So I think it's really important that if people want to learn the essence of really good breath control, they've got to understand the use of the muscles of breathing, including how to make the diaphragm always be working. A key to that is making sure the anal mouth is not constricted, but rather open. And in the yoga world, that's called kriya. It's called basti kriya. So that you learn how to inhale into the pelvic floor, into your abdomen, and then take the breath to the chest without losing the sense of the diaphragm having descended. That's for most people almost impossible. Most people's intercostals don't work properly unless they inhibit the diaphragm, which is just a manifestation of stress. It's I would love to talk to you more. I'm totally excited talking to you. I want to look into your work. And if you said you've got a book, I'll have a look into that as well. If you want to send me some links. Yeah, I do
Fantastic.
unfortunately have to drive off now and go do something else, but probably this is long
Fantastic.
enough for most
I
people
I
anyway.
truly appreciate it, and there's been so much wisdom. I'll end with a little story, and then I'll let you go if that's okay. There's actually a freediver called Jacques Mayol. You may have heard this before,
Yes, yes, amazing guy.
but he was quite alternative back in the day, because the others would focus on the diving, and he would spend half the year doing yoga and the other half diving, right? So he would go to India, and he had this teacher in India, and one day I think they were in Varkala, and they were near the ocean, and this teacher was like, after teaching Jacques yoga for years and years and years, he said, okay, so show me this diving thing that you do, right? Show me what you do when you're not here. And so Jacques said, okay, we're going to go into the ocean and we're going to hold our breath, right? And he said, no, just hold it for as long as you can, right, without any expectation. And this teacher had never done freediving before. And so they went into the ocean together, and Jacques would sit on the water and hold, I think he held his breath for 6 minutes. Really, really, really long. This is without hyperventilation, right? And then he got out and he noticed that his teacher was still on the water, right? This
Still on
guru.
the water, yeah.
Yeah. And so he was a bit freaked, and he said, okay, maybe he's pushed it too far. And then he waited another minute or 2 minutes. And after about 8.5 minutes, the teacher came out of the water and just very serene and very still. And Jacques was like, are you okay? And he said, Jacques, I indeed agree that you found a shortcut.
Yes, yes. I think I read that in a book about him as well. It was a great story and I loved it. And that's where I remember I said to you at the start that my father also had learned, his teachings probably came from India. It was recalling that story that I actually had thought that, because the freediving world going back to that time was only quite narrow. It was quite small. My father won a medal from the Queen because in 1953 he saw a bus had crashed over the cliffs, a school bus, and it fell into, I was born in Malta as my father was, and it fell into the very cold at the time Mediterranean Sea, went quite a long way underwater, like maybe 20 meters or something. And the school children had all gotten out, but the bus driver was trapped in the bus. He'd been unconscious for 20 minutes. And my father jumped into the cold sea, went down, got him out, and he won a medal for it. And that's where his free diving came in to, save people. So I'm
What a
proud of my
story.
dad. I love my dad.
Incredible, Simon. Thank you so much for your wisdom. And I'm excited. My heart's on fire because I found a new teacher, and I appreciate your
Bless
time.
you. It's a
I
pleasure to
appreciate the
meet you. I
energy.
have a lot to learn from you, I think, too. And if you want to come visit me next week, come visit me if you feel like it.
I
You
actually am
take care.
driving up, so we will chat more.
Okay, fantastic. Great to chat. Thank you very, very much. And talk to you soon.